The Steam Deck has easily been one of my favorite devices since the Nintendo Switch. The ability to play AAA titles in a handheld still impresses me, and of course, it's one of the best ways to play the Final Fantasy series. When the Steam Deck first came out, I made a video that took a quick look into how well the series plays on this device, and concluded that most, if not all, the Final Fantasy games on Steam worked in some capacity on the Steam Deck. But now that time has passed, I've had a chance to fully play the entire mainline series on the Steam Deck, and I wanted to give an update and give a more accurate look into the franchise. And so 1 year later, this is Final Fantasy on the Steam Deck. Since the launch of the Steam Deck, every single Final Fantasy title on Steam has a rating. As of now, these are the titles that are verified. That means that these games should work right from installing it. These titles are rated playable. That means that these games should still work for the most part, but may run into minor issues during the gameplay. These titles are rated unsupported. As stated in the last video, unsupported does not mean unplayable. It just means that there may be some problems running the game without tinkering, or certain gameplay performances that may not be the most ideal. An observation that I can say is that Square Enix is definitely on board with the Steam Deck, and clearly trying to make sure that the games that have been released since the Steam Deck's launch are either verified or playable, with some exceptions. And that is just a great sign for Final Fantasy fans. Also, before we start, I will try to make an effort to not only show the Steam rating, but the Protondb rating, and various information such as native FPS caps and battery life, as I'm sure most people watching this video will want to see how well the Steam Deck performs. I will also note that my Steam Deck is still showing 100% battery life, so hopefully this will give an accurate reading into the Steam Deck's battery life 1 year after its release. All the mentions of battery life within this video are estimates and will vary depending on in-game presets and Steam Deck configuration. And finally, I've tried my best to include game scope information to show GPU and CPU usage, frame rate, and frame time. But without further ado, let's start with the pixel remasters. I need to mention that since the last video, the Pixel Remasters have been announced and released for the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation 4, meaning that there are now multiple ways to play these titles, especially portably. In fact, the Nintendo Switch will be able to play the first 12 Final Fantasies and Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition, making the Switch a great portable Final Fantasy machine. However, if you still want achievements and/or want to play more titles within the franchise, the Steam Deck is still a great Final Fantasy machine. Now, there isn't much change from the original video. The first 4 Pixel Remasters are rated verified, while 5 and 6 are rated playable. They still run perfectly fine at 60 FPS with some slowdowns sometimes in Final Fantasy V, and last about 6 to 7 hours on a full battery. One thing to note, as I got a few comments from the last video, there is a way to bring up the virtual keyboard for name inputs within the game. By holding the Steam button and pressing X, this eliminates the need for an external keyboard for the Steam Deck. Getting to the DS remakes, Final Fantasy III is rated playable, runs at 30 FPS, and lasts about 6 to 7 hours on a full battery. I will mention that a lot of these games will have a launcher and will require a mouse input. You can either use the touchscreen or change the right trackpad to a mouse input. Now, the Final Fantasy IV 3D remake is the only game on this list that had its Steam rating demoted from verified to playable. This is because it is still required to change the Proton compatibility to Proton 4.11-13 in the settings in order for the music to play during the game. This game will run at 30 FPS and dropping to 15 FPS in battle. The game will also last about 6 to 7 hours on a full battery. Moving on to Final Fantasy IV The After Years, very similar to the 3D remake, it is rated playable, runs at 30 FPS in field and 15 FPS in battle. However, unlike its predecessor, you do not need to set the Proton compatibility for this game, as it'll work fine on install. Now with Final Fantasy V and VI mobile versions, Final Fantasy V is rated unsupported, and Final Fantasy VI is rated playable. They both run at 60 FPS. However, Final Fantasy V did cause me a bit of trouble as it crashed on me a few times, and is probably the reason why it's unsupported. However, both of these games are unlisted and will not be possible to purchase them through the Steam store. Going to Final Fantasy VII, the game is rated playable and runs at 30 FPS. As stated in the last video, the game will use generic inputs within the game itself. You also may need an external keyboard this time around, or set one of the back buttons to the X key in order to get past the starting menu. And one additional fact, the game does not support Steam cloud saves. This is because the game uses Square Enix cloud saves instead, and you'll need a Square Enix account in order to save and transfer the saves from one device to another. With Final Fantasy VIII, there are two versions of the game sold on Steam, the original PC port and the remaster. The original PC port is unsupported and runs 30 FPS on the field and 15 FPS in battle. The problem with this version is that the music will not play during the gameplay, and will need a bit of tinkering by installing Proton tricks and following a few steps in order to get the music working. However, like in the last video, I still recommend just getting the remastered version, as it is verified on the Steam Deck and works right on install. Like the PC port, it still runs at 30 FPS on the field and 15 FPS in battle. And most importantly, the music works. Now, oddly enough, Final Fantasy IX is still unsupported. However, I can confirm that the game works perfectly fine with no crashes for me during my own playthrough. The game runs at a constant 30 FPS. Like with Final Fantasy VII, however, the game also does not use the Steam cloud saves, but rather the Square Enix cloud saves. And finally, although I don't have it on my own Steam Deck, the Meguri mod works on Final Fantasy IX. Just beware, as it does have its own problems that are not related to the Steam Deck, such as certain cutscenes not working, but for the most part should work perfectly fine on the Steam Deck. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy X and X-2 Remastered. The whole bundle is rated playable. Final Fantasy X works at 30 FPS with about 4 to 5 hours of gameplay on a full battery. There was something that I noticed. If your Steam Deck framerate limiter was set to 30 FPS, the load time between battles will be significantly longer. This might happen if your game scope is on a generic profile rather than a per game basis. The best way to solve this is just keep the limiter uncapped and the load times will be fine. And now let's get to Final Fantasy X-2. This is something I completely skipped over on the last video because I just assumed that since 10 works, X-2 also works as well. Final Fantasy X-2 is probably the reason why this game isn't fully verified. The game itself will unfortunately crash on launch. According to Protondb, there is no real solution to making this game work natively on the Steam Deck. However, this will lead me to introduce the Steam Link streaming from PC to Steam Deck. With this, you'll be able to play Final Fantasy X-2 on the Steam Deck provided you have a PC and a decent internet connection to the Steam Deck. The game itself runs with very minimal input lag and is a great alternative if you want to play X-2 on the Steam Deck. But unfortunately, as of this recording, there is still no solution to making X-2 work natively on the Steam Deck. Now with Final Fantasy XI, I can definitely say that this is a great way to play, as grinding on the Steam Deck can be done at the comfort of a bed or a couch. The game itself runs on 30 FPS and will give about 2 to 3 hours of gameplay on a full battery. Several things I need to mention is that both Windower and Ashita have been confirmed to work on the Steam Deck, but you will need to tinker a bit in order for both to work. Of course, running these will be at your own discretion, mainly because it is known that some add-ons will give a bit of trouble when running on the Steam Deck, such as running 60 FPS. This will make certain areas not work. But if you want great quality of life add-ons while playing Final Fantasy XI, it is still very much possible to use both on the Steam Deck. Not really much to say about this next game, as Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age is fully verified, runs incredibly well on the Steam Deck, running at a gorgeous 60 FPS on medium settings, and will last about 3 to 4 hours on a full battery. So I'll admit that I was a little harsh on the last video with Final Fantasy XIII simply due to having poor performance even before the Steam Deck's launch. I will still recommend the Xbox version of the trilogy simply due to not having any performance problems. However, the Steam version of Final Fantasy XIII is rated playable, and with implementing the FF13 fix, the stutter issues aren't actually that bad. I found that the gameplay on the field and during battle run mostly smooth at 30 FPS. It is only in between loading, either transitioning into battle or cutscenes, that the stuttering is prevalent. The other real problem I found was that the game crashed on me during the Suneth Waterscape section of the game. But otherwise, I will say that this is not a terrible way to play Final Fantasy XIII, and if it's your only option, it is definitely playable on the Steam Deck. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is rated unsupported and is still the worst of the trilogy in terms of performance. I found that even implementing the FF13 fix, cutscenes will still dip into the single-digit frame rate. Like with Final Fantasy XIII, loading between battles and cutscenes seemed to have the worst stuttering. Although I have never experienced it myself yet, there have been some reports of crashing constantly even as early as the first few hours of the game. However, there are also some reports that say that Final Fantasy XIII-2 ran much more smoothly on their Steam Decks, and this might be because of later Steam Decks having much more updated hardware. And so if you can stomach the constant stuttering, the game itself can definitely be played, just don't go into it expecting the smoothest playthrough. And finally, with Lightning Returns, this is still the best of the trilogy in terms of performance, as no FF13 fix is needed in order to smooth out the frame rate. The game itself runs at 30 FPS and is rated playable with about 3 to 5 hours on a full battery. The game will still have stutters, but in comparison with the previous two games, it's not something to be concerned about. Moving on to the reason why I bought the Steam Deck, Final Fantasy XIV has been upgraded from unsupported to playable. The Steam version of the game can now be installed without doing any workarounds. However, I can still confirm that the workaround does work. It just won't be necessary due to 14 Launcher also confirmed to work on the Steam Deck as well. The 14 Launcher website actually has instructions on how to make the 14 Launcher work on the Steam Deck. This means that both Steam and non-Steam users can play Final Fantasy XIV without any troubles. This also means that add-ons through 14 Launcher can be used on the Steam Deck. It seems as though ACT has not been confirmed to work. However, there seems to be a replacement for it on the Steam Deck. Link to it down in the description. The game itself can run at a full 60 FPS with settings on laptop high, with expected drops in FPS on high population areas such as cities or alliance dungeons, and sees about 3 to 5 hours on a full battery. With the Steam Deck, there is also many options that you can use to get the most out of the game, such as configuring the trackpad to do multiple functions in-game. I found that playing Final Fantasy XIV, doing casual content like dailies and dungeons, is a great way to play this game, and I would definitely recommend this device to anyone who plays Final Fantasy XIV. Now let's get to Final Fantasy XV. One of the most graphically intensive Final Fantasy games on Steam, this game is verified. The game can hit 60 FPS on its lowest setting and runs about 1 to 2 hours on a full battery. However, I would recommend playing on average and play with the 40 FPS limiter to get the best compromise between performance and visuals. You can also lower the resolution in order to trigger the FSR if you want to try and squeeze out the battery life, although in my opinion it's so minuscule that I would just play at 800p anyway. In keeping with graphically intensive games, Final Fantasy VII Remake is also very similar to Final Fantasy XV. It's verified and runs about 1 to 2 hours on a full battery. In my opinion, the game still looks absolutely great on low settings just due to the smaller screen and running with a 40 FPS limiter. Lowering the resolution to trigger FSR is always an option as well. In my opinion, these two games running on the Steam Deck is still incredibly impressive. The fact that when 7 Remake was announced for Steam, Square Enix made an effort to mention the Steam Deck and to also announce its verified status. This gives me hope that future games by Square Enix will have the Steam Deck in mind when porting to the PC. And before we move on from Final Fantasy VII, Crisis Core Reunion is also a verified title for the Steam Deck. It can last about 2 to 3 hours on a full battery, and it can hit 60 FPS on its lowest setting, although I can still recommend medium setting and limiting the frame rate to 40 FPS. One thing I will mention is that the graphics themselves seem to be saved within the game itself, so if you're the type of person who switches between PC and Steam Deck, just be aware as you'll probably need to change it if you were playing on high on PC and medium on Steam Deck. Moving on to some of the side games of the franchise, World of Final Fantasy is rated playable and caps its FPS to 30. I have found that the game may crash on launch, and you'll probably need to restart the device in order to fix this problem. When the problem gets fixed, you'll be able to enjoy World of Final Fantasy for about 2 to 3 hours on a full battery. Final Fantasy Type 0 is rated unsupported, and as stated in the last video, you'll need to force the compatibility to Protondb 7-10 in order for the cutscenes to work. Once that is set, you should be able to enjoy this game in its entirety on the Steam Deck. I have found that running the game on medium settings will give the smoothest performance. The game runs at 30 FPS and will also run between 2 to 3 hours on a full battery. And finally, we have the most recent Final Fantasy game on Steam, Stranger of Paradise. With the last video, I found that I was having problems running the game through Heroic Launcher, but since then, some users have found that it is still playable if you set a certain Proton compatibility and tweak the launch options. Now with the launch of Stranger of Paradise on Steam, the game is officially rated unsupported. This is because there are still going to be problems launching the game without tweaking it. By inputting this command into the launch options and forcing the game to Proton GE54, the game will launch. But once in the game, it still won't be a smooth experience. While the game can hit 60 FPS on its lowest setting, it will never be consistent. All cutscenes cap out at 30 FPS, but I found that cutscenes will often run between 10 and 20 FPS regardless of graphic settings. I would recommend setting the game to performance mode in order to have the smoothest gameplay experience. You should be able to play the game on medium with a limiter on 30 or 40 FPS without too much trouble. And like with other graphically intensive games, Stranger of Paradise will only last about an hour on a full battery. I briefly mentioned emulation on the last video, and combined with the large Final Fantasy library already on Steam, this is what makes the Steam Deck truly one of the best ways to play all the Final Fantasies on a single device. Games like Mystic Quest, Crystal Chronicles, Dissidia, and Tactics are all possible thanks to emulation on the Steam Deck, and with the Steam OS on Linux, it has never been easier to play other Final Fantasy games on the Steam Deck. And one last thing before I end this video, I mentioned that game streaming is possible on the Steam Deck. With a program named Chiaki, it is possible to stream your PS5 onto the Steam Deck. This will allow upcoming titles like Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to be enjoyed on the Steam Deck, provided of course you have a PS5 and a decent internet connection on the Steam Deck. Like with the Steam Link, streaming through Chiaki seems to have minimal input lag, and it is honestly impressive that the device can stream the PS5. And with that, this is the updated video for Final Fantasy on the Steam Deck. As I said before, this truly is an amazing machine, but not just for Final Fantasy, but gaming in general. The fact that 1 year later I can still enjoy these games on the go is absolutely fantastic. I have not only played the Final Fantasy series on this device, but other games like Persona and NieR at the comfort of a bed or couch. While I can acknowledge that the battery life isn't the greatest, surprisingly, I haven't really found it to be too much of a problem. I'm still interested to see how far the Steam Deck will go, but 1 year later, it seems to have a bright future in gaming. Anyway, thank you for watching. I really hope this video helps in any way with future users of the Steam Deck. If you enjoyed this video, I've got a lot of video ideas on the way, so don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss any future videos. And I will see you in the next video.